This is not going to be a positive review. If you don't like to see negative or kind of ranty reviews, this one's probably not for you. Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video we will be talking about The Warrior by Stephen Aryan, which was unfortunately a very big disappointment for me. So I quite enjoyed The Coward, which is the first book. This is a duology, so this is the second and final book. And The Warrior I had heard was not as good as The Coward. Even with lowered expectations, though, I just had so many issues with this book. And I try not to make a ton of negative reviews, but this one I have so many comments and thoughts that I want to kind of discuss, and so I decided, because I have so much to say, I just am going to do it. So, like I said, sorry if you're not a fan of the negative reviews, you can definitely not watch this, but I really wanted to talk about it because The Warrior, I think, fails on pretty much every fundamental level for me, with everything that it is trying to be. And I want to talk about why, and hope that other people can find some insight in things to think about with sequels, because this is a sequel to The Coward. And for me, it fails as a sequel because it really doesn't do anything with what happened in the first book. The first book, especially the ending of it, had some pretty big bombshells that were talked about, like this was going to be a really big deal. That is all basically irrelevant in the second book. We don't really follow up on it. It's mentioned early on, once again, like it's going to be important, like it's going to come up, and then we just sort of forget about it. And so I'm wondering why it was talked about so much, made such a big deal, some secrets from the end of the first book. Just not even to be talked about. And then we get to as the final book in a series. And once again, this really doesn't do a great job there either, because what we're doing is, instead of focusing on kind of completing the character arc that was started in the first book, we're really focusing more so on a secondary character that's also brand new, that was not even in the first book. This is more of a story about the character Odd than it is about Calcressia, who is the main character in the first book. And the other returning character as well is somehow also not the focus, despite what the plot of this book is, because the plot of this book is Willow, who's an Alfar, comes back to the Five Kingdoms to enlist Kel's help because there's a problem in her homeland and she's hoping that he can help. So you think we're going to have Kel, Willow be the focus? Nope. We're really focusing on this new character, Odd. And that's where this kind of, even as its own standalone book, because you could read this as a standalone, to be honest, because like I said, it really doesn't have a whole lot to do with the first book. It references it a bit, but the first book references the original thing that happened that's off screen plenty as well. So you could read this as a standalone, but even as a standalone, I don't think this works, because we spend a lot of time setting up this other character, and then where all of the characters end up, I feel like it doesn't really make sense, or it doesn't really do a lot, and the plot just kind of fizzles the further you get. The whole point of it, which is never super clear to begin with, becomes even less clear, and to the point where I'm just thinking to myself, why are we doing any of this at all? There's not really any resolution either, which is, the end of the series thing. You kind of want some resolution. We just kind of meander aimlessly toward our goal, and then whatever. I don't really care about the quest anymore. We're just gonna really quick fast forward to an end and just not really do anything to resolve any of the other things set up in this book. We have character relationships, character arcs, things that are set up in this book, some bigger events that are set up in this book, and they just sort of end without really having a whole lot added to it. We get a very short epilogue that's kind of giving like the history later, that's supposed to, I guess, give a little bit more, but none of it really was resolved at all in a satisfying or complete way. Even if there was going to be a third book, I wouldn't read it, because I feel like this, not only did this just not really work as a book, but it didn't set up anything or any real thing to be like, oh, I wonder what's going to happen next. Like, nope, it just kind of said like, oh, we've been spending all this time, these hundreds of pages, focusing on these things, and everybody's just going to fizzle out in their own way. All of the characters, although they do have some like growth in some ways, also just kind of fizzle. Like I said, the characters, the plot, everything just sort of fizzles, or it's just fast forwarded over, because we get fast forwarding in the story as well. This takes place over quite a bit of time, unlike the first one, which is a much shorter amount of time, but this takes place over quite a bit of time, and we're following different POVs, and for one POV especially, we just fast forward through a ton of events. So we feel like this is supposed to be important, I imagine, but we're not really spending enough time with the characters that are getting fast forwarded to really dig in that much or to see the plot that's going on. It's just, once again, we're just told, like, oh, this is happening now, and it just kind of keeps going like that. And then at the end, once again, where we just fast forward and go to the end with no explanation for why any of the things that are happening, it just makes it a really poor end to the book, to the series, and as a sequel, it just, like I said, really didn't do anything right. Now, I know I've been extremely negative here, but I'm trying to be constructive with this critique, because I think when you are writing a book, a series, a sequel, a duology, these things, you have to think about the structure of the series as a whole, the structure of the book on its own, and also the structure of a series ending, and those are really important things to think about. This just felt like, The Coward was meant to be a standalone, and the author decided they wanted to add a second book to it, because I liked The Coward, and I would still read The Coward as a standalone and just let myself wonder about what might have happened with the things that are revealed and set up, because once again, we don't get anything with that in this book. There's no follow-up or really importance to the big things that were discovered in the first book. It's just basically irrelevant, and so we don't get any of that. So if I reread the first book, still have a good time, and then just think about what might happen. I still don't know the answer, so I feel like I would still enjoy the first book, and I would still definitely recommend The Coward if you read it as a standalone, but I really can't recommend The Warrior, because it just simply does not work on any level for me. I gave this 2 stars. I started with a 3 because it's written fine. The actual writing is pretty solid, and I didn't have problems with the writing itself. But like I said, when it's just every fundamental level, I felt like there were huge flaws and huge problems. I really couldn't give this anything beyond a 2. And I didn't hate the book. It's not a 1. It's not like, this is garbage, I'm a DNF. I finished the book. As I was getting toward the end, I was kind of thinking, like, I don't really care about this at all, though. That was definitely true, just because I felt like the things that we were exploring, the things we were spending page time with, just became less and less important, made less and less sense, and just really went nowhere. And ultimately, everything kind of did go nowhere for me. I don't feel like anything was appropriately wrapped up. There were, like I said, characters who were supposed to be the focus were not, and had way less focus than you would think for the main characters of a book, so that we can instead set up other characters. But even those characters didn't really, have a huge change into being important or setting things up or having these really big arcs. There is some stuff that happened, and I'm being vague here because I thought about making this a spoiler rant, but I feel like I've gotten my points across without spoilers. For the most part, and mostly I don't want to spoil the first book, because I still recommend the first book if you haven't read it with it. So, and there's a lot of things for me to more explain why nothing is continued over. I'd have to completely spoil the first book, and so I've been trying to avoid that. But I just felt like this really did not work. Now, I'm not writing off this author. Like I said, I really enjoyed The Coward. I've heard that Stephen Aryan's new stuff and some of his older stuff is good as well. So I'm not completely writing the author off. I really question what the idea behind this was, because it really felt like the book was kind of aimless, or that it was like an outline and we were just rambling along, and like he was trying to figure out what was going to happen and never really did. That's just kind of how it felt. It didn't feel complete as its own story. It didn't feel complete to end a series, and it didn't feel like it built upon the first book in any satisfying way to justify there being a sequel. And I know with this in general, he was very inspired by David Gemmell, especially with this series, and that was really clear in the first book. The Coward felt like it was very inspired by Gemmell and by Abercrombie a little bit as well, I think, because there was that kind of dual feel of the heroic fantasy with a little bit of the kind of Abercrombieism for the way that he writes. But this book was the sequel that just didn't quite work. And I mean, Gemmell has done some sequels, and sometimes the sequels are not quite as good as the first book, but they always have a point and serve some sort of purpose. Because, like, King Beyond the Gate is a sequel to Legend, and I liked Legend more, but I thought it did a really good job. And like, I just read Waylander 2, sequel to Waylander, was not quite as good as the first Waylander, in my opinion, but also did some really cool things and still was a very enjoyable experience. So that was kind of like taking books from like a 5 to a 4 with the sequel to explore a little bit more. This though, I was at like a 4 or a 5 for The Coward, and this, like I said, dropped all the way down to a 2 because it just did not work. So those really are my thoughts on The Warrior. Like I said, I know this was a largely negative. I've tried to be really constructive with my negative comments and my critiques here, and not just, attack the book or the author or anything like that. I just think this had some really fundamental problems, and unfortunately was just a really disappointing read for me. But let me know if you agree or disagree. I feel like most people I've heard from who have read this did not have nearly as negative a reaction as I did, so I'd be curious to hear people's thoughts on this. With it, definitely let me know in the comments. Otherwise, make sure to give the video a like if you enjoyed it. Check the link in the description, as always, for the Wizardly Do It Discord if you want to chat books, whether this book, other books, any books, really anything at all. It is a lot of fun, and we'd love to have you. And of course, if you enjoy my content, make sure to subscribe.